Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers.
Today, I'm joined by Matt Milligan. Matt started out as a consultant at EY. After climbing the ranks into a senior consulting role, Matt founded an internal venture helping SaaS founders connect with VCs and help them sell POCs into enterprise. Having shown a knack for business development and interest in SaaS, Matt transitioned to EY-Seren, EY's specialist digital transformation and innovation agency, head up their business development team. During this time, Matt decided to start his own SaaS company, Uhubs, a sales development and training platform for enterprise. Fast forward to today, and Uhubs has grown over 40 employees. Matt's achievements have also been recognized by Forbes in the 30 under 30 social impact list in 2021. Matt, look, I really appreciate you taking the time and chatting to me.
Yeah, no worries at all, Freddie, and appreciate you having me on the show.
Amazing. Well, look, I've been excited to have this conversation with you, Matt, and specifically around Uhubs and your sales development and sales training sort of background. But of all the places I think we could start, let's start with you're on the front line day to day. You have why sales teams struggle to ramp and what sales leaders are or aren't doing to mitigate this. What's one thing that you see sales leaders miss that'll make an 80-20 difference to ramping and upskilling sales teams?
Yeah, sure. It's really hard to choose one thing, so I'll try my best. But I think ultimately there's a number of factors that influence successful ramp. And for those sales leaders listening to this, they'll be aware of the importance of ramp time as a key metric. The ability to ramp up a sales hire to full productivity is an essential requirement for hitting an overall revenue target. So we've seen many of the VPs of sales, chief revenue officers that we work with have really come to us with slow ramp time being an existential threat to their job. They've gone out, they've made a bunch of hires, but if you can't get those hires productive quick enough, then all that's doing is eating into your bottom line. It's a cost to the business, and salespeople, as you know, Freddie, are expensive. So ramp time is front of mind for most of the sales leaders that we work with here at Uhubs. I think just the first thing I'd say before I jump into the one thing that I'd focus on, something that's very underestimated, or two things. I think one is slow ramp times are not only important for hitting your overall revenue number, but ramp time, our experience is ramp time is very closely correlated with attrition. So if salespeople are taking too long to get up to full productivity, they're also not going to be earning their OTE, right? They're not going to be earning their on target earnings. So they're going to be looking for other jobs. And that takes you back to square one as a revenue leader. I think just the second thing to bear in mind for ramp time is the importance of hiring, because ultimately you can have the best onboarding and enablement approach in the world, but rubbish in equals rubbish out. Sales hiring is an incredibly hard thing to do well, but if you've made a bad hire, you're fighting an uphill battle from day one, right? A very roundabout way of saying, to answer your question, what's the number one thing that we've seen move the needle most when it does come to successful ramp? I think that word would be structure. So, for the organizations that I've worked with and alongside who really struggled with ramp up time, they haven't had any clear structure and define. What I mean by structure is just having a clear set of defined milestones. Like, what are you trying to achieve with each of your new reps as they come into your organization? And how are you going to take them from point A to point B in a as time effective way as possible? And it's amazing. Like, it's baffling how many businesses just do not have this simple structure in place. There's a number of different reasons we can go into around why I think that is. But yeah, to answer your question, I think the main word here is structure.
Yeah, well, let's run on that theme. I mean, why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it comes down to lack of time. The modern day revenue leader has so many things crying out for his or her attention. They have to wear multiple hats. They're trying to figure out the forecast. They're trying to figure out the headcount plan. They're trying to figure out the strategy, go to market, messaging, positioning, pricing, packaging, you name it. So the list goes on. It's a tough job. And I think particularly for those organizations that don't have dedicated enablement functions, it's really difficult to find enough hours in the day to be intentional about your onboarding and ramp efforts. So as a result of that, yeah, unfortunately, we just see a really big gaping hole in our industry where lots of sales reps are, they rock up on day one. They're given a random like Notion page with a bunch of content in it. They're expected to make sense of that. And then they're theoretically given a phone and a target list. And then, off you go. It's crazy, really. But I think a lot of it comes down to just lack of time.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Switching up to looking back at your experience, specifically at EY in consulting and having headed up their business development team for SaaS and starting the founder network, having been a part or a key part of their business development function and working with other founders to sell POCs specifically into enterprise. If you had to choose another one thing, what has helped you sell, grow Uhubs the most, especially into enterprise, that you've learned out of those years working in EY and doing that consulting work for them?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I would summarize it as consultative sales fundamentally. Like I think a lot of our success as a business comes down to being able to sell in a very consultative way. And as you hit upon like that was my kind of background. I very early in my career been building things really since I was at school, but spent a good period of time at one of the big four in consulting and got a front row seat watching partners at EY just basically at the top of their game. That is true consultative selling, the way that those guys operate. And, some of these partners are closing, we jokingly talk about closing 6-figure deals on the reg. These guys are closing multi-million pound contracts and they're doing it and then they're making it look incredibly easy. And the way that they're doing that is the observation I made really early on when I was involved in partner meetings. And it's funny, I was with a partner yesterday, one of our customers, Treatwell, and the GM, Robert, is someone I've got a great relationship with. He's also from a consulting background. So, he and I were having this discussion around, I think management consulting is actually a really good place to cut your teeth and learn sales, because you do learn true consultative sales skills. And those partners are mightily impressive, the way that they operate, the way that they go about their business. And it's small things, right? Like one of the observations I made, which I still try to do to this day, is they will always take experiences from one customer and bring them into another customer. So they're opening the conversation with immense value because they're basically bringing insights from this work that they've done with their competitor down the road. And they're saying, look, this is what we've done with this customer and this is what we learned. And these are the key priorities for them and how they're thinking about the market right now. Curious to hear how you're thinking about those same challenges. And what that does is it just positions you as a trusted advisor in the eyes of the customer. So that consultative sales skill set is something that I think is hard to develop. It's something that is really important in today's world. And I think the world that we're moving into with AI and sales, I think a lot of the transactional high volume sales is frankly going to be automated. I don't know if you saw the Tesla cold calling generative AI. It was insane. Like it literally sounds just like an SDR. So some things are getting weird quickly. And I think what that means is that there's going to be much more of an emphasis around true consultative salespeople who have, large networks that they can lean into, that they have unique insights that they can bring and share with their customers. And I was fortunate enough to learn about consultative selling very early on in my career.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you expanding on that, Matt. I think you're right with the transactional sales, especially in that front end for the, SMB motion. A lot of that is going to be very, very transactional, as you say, automated, but opens this wide market up for mid-market enterprise and above for that consultative sales approach, because a lot of that is just relationship building. And I can imagine when you're at EY, a lot of that was just building on that relationship rather than, on top of that, I guess the methodical way of thinking about sales in that, this is blueprint, what we've done previously for other clients. Let's look at your business and a very methodical way of thinking about sales and consulting. And I think in software, sometimes specifically within the SaaS industry, I think that gets a little bit misty sometimes. Everyone always thinks there's going to be budget when that's not necessarily the case. And yeah, so look, I really appreciate you expanding on that. Thinking back over those last, 6-7 years, and specifically thinking about your journey building Uhubs in particular, this is a question that we kind of ask all guests that come on the show. And you can be as explicit and specific as you like with this question. What has been the toughest moment in your career, if you had to choose one? And how have you dealt with that? Not necessarily to help others avoid those mistakes, but better deal with some of those possibly inevitable pitfalls or whatever comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, how long have we got, Freddie? There's a long list. It's pretty hard to choose, but, hey, look, like I think working as a founder and working also as a sales leader and a sales rep, there's a lot of similarities. You're dealing with constant rejection. You're having to build resilience and sort of keep picking yourself up. And I always think about trying not to get too high and trying not to get too low, because particularly in startup world, the highs are high, the lows are really low, and there's definitely more lows than highs. So always just trying to keep steady and constant, which is a challenge. I think back to a couple of things. We had a period very early on in the business, which was we'd been bootstrapping, testing stuff out, myself, my co-founder Ash, and 2020, it was early 2020 when we had developed an MVP. We had gone out and got some commits from customers and felt like we'd really honed in on an opportunity to solve some of these enablement and training challenges in a slightly different way. And we were fundraising. So we were raising our first funding round from mostly angel investors. So this was like our pre-seed funding round. And we set a close date for 31st of March. Obviously, it's the end of the financial tax year. So for anyone that's raised money in the UK, you'll know that there's this wonderful thing called FCIS, which makes fundraising a lot easier. And also just to lean on this, right? Like fundraising is just the sales process. It is different to selling a product, but it is just the sales process. So anyway, we rounded up all these investors in Q1 of 2020. And I was then absolutely struck down with this weird illness. And I was the most sick I've ever been in my life. I was in bed for like 3 or 4 days. Ash and I were trying to get this funding round closed. It was coming up to the end of the financial tax year. So we had this hard deadline. We had to get the money in the bank by then. And it turns out that weird disease I had was a thing called COVID. And then the whole world just seemed to kind of capitulate around us in those final weeks of March. We closed that funding round on the day. So on the 31st of March, I was still full of COVID. And funny enough, that's also the same day that I completed the purchase of my first property. So I just bought a flat. And that wasn't supposed to complete until like May, June. But they brought everything forward because of this lockdown that was happening. So I think that was, you talk about like your energy reserves and how like stressful closing a deal. That was pretty intense. And I was sick as a dog. And I look back on that time, that took a lot out of me. So that was a pretty tough time. You got it done.
Yeah. I appreciate you expanding on that. I can imagine everything coming to that one moment, especially before COVID. I mean, would you have said that? I mean, I'm assuming you were 100% bootstrap before that. Were you surviving on customer funds at that time? Or did you need the funding to kind of get you through what I guess no one really knew how long the lockdown was going to go on for anyway. But I mean, could you have made that in hindsight?
You try, you try to take calculated risk. So to answer your questions, we had some early revenues, but they weren't enough to sort of properly pay to salaries for both of us. So we had bootstrapped, we'd put some of our own cash into the business to get us going. You know, we had funded an MVP that we had built ourselves with some support from friends and people on Fiverr. So we needed to close the funds in order to jump in full time. And you know, Ash had just finished writing his book, so he'd written a book about his journey at Just Eat and all the rest. And I quit my job, so I'd taken this kind of calculated risk to, you know, do the leap of faith. So I didn't have any income at the time coming in beyond March. I was just kind of living off savings. We needed the angel investment to come in order to, pay our bills. And we were obviously taking small founder salaries, but we needed that cash to come in. So, and I almost think that sometimes you've got to take those risks because it becomes like a forcing function. So it's like, you know, that you have to figure out a way to get it done. Otherwise, what else are you going to do? So I think when there's not really another option. And it's amazing as well. You know, I was reflecting on this the other day, with other subsequent funding rounds, for example. The goal that you set yourself is pretty much always the amount you raise. So it's like, I don't know, it's like a law of attraction thing, but it's almost like your mind is so focused on that one number. It always seems to be to the penny, the amount that you raise. And it's quite often the same with sales, right? It's like you set yourself a sales target and somehow you always seem to come up, you know, right on the number. It's a weird thing. Makes me think that we need to set the goals a bit higher.
Fast forward to, I guess, today, and specifically over the last kind of 6 to 9 months, I think a lot of sales teams in general and market wide have seen budget scrutiny, larger buying teams, greater resistance to test out new tools, especially because of all of those different other factors. And that's made quota attainment much harder in the last 6 to 9 months. What are you, as a kind of sales leader yourself, doing to address this and helping your team at Uhubs avoid some of these pitfalls to kind of address that?
Yeah, so a couple of things we've done. I think that the first thing worth mentioning is when the market changes, you have to change with the times, right? So many customers that I've been working with were maybe a little bit slow to adapt, and they're paying price for that now, unfortunately. And if you just keep doing more of the same thing and expect to get different results, it's not going to happen. So we changed up our pricing and packaging completely. So I think we struggled a bit in Q4 last year because we were trying to sell the whole product. So there's 3 different components to what we do at Hubs. You know, we do what we call competency analytics. So we help sales leaders and their teams understand their strengths and opportunity areas to develop and improve. And we do that using a range of different data. So that's kind of like our trigger product. That's our USP. We then have what we call pathways. So we use the data to recommend really clear development and onboarding and everboarding journeys. And then the third piece we have is content. So we have three kind of modules. And Q4 last year, we were trying to sell the whole shebang. And when the times were good, you know, the first half of last year, we were doing that consistently, and it looks like we had really strong product market fit. Then all of a sudden, as you mentioned, things pulled back, and they pulled back pretty quickly, particularly in the tech market, and budgets getting scrutinized. Deal size was a really big thing because anything above 5K in our experience was then getting elevated up to CFO and just a lot more decision makers. One of the things we've done this year is we've just unbundled our offering and we've made it modular. So what that's meant is we've moved towards much smaller initial deal sizes. So ATVs 25, like literally 10 to 25% of what it was last year. And then much more emphasis on expansion. And yeah, go back to your point. It's like the market is telling you something that bigger deal sizes are much harder to get across the line. Like, don't persist with wasting your time trying to get in front of, we had at one point in Q4, I think we had like 4 or 5 deals blocked by CFO when we had pre-agreed budget from who we thought was the economic buyer. And then all of a sudden out of the blue, the CFO came in. It was just like, no. So we adjusted and we figured out ways to go a bit more under the radar. How can we tap into smaller budget pots where we don't need to go through a much bigger procurement process straight away? And what it's done is it's really helped our deal velocity. So we've been able to close much more logos this year, albeit at smaller deal sizes. So it's taking a bit more time for us to get that revenue line up. But the plan now is like really second half of this year is really focusing on expansion and customer success. And the good news is we've done quite a lot of acquisition in the first half of this year. So feeling optimistic. But that's just a couple of things we've done. There's other stuff as well, right? Like flipped up our whole scripts and messaging to adjust to the times. And we try to do that every 90 days. There's no point going out to market with a message that's stale and out of date because it's just not going to land.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting that breaking up and then focusing on the CS side to expand those accounts. I mean, how much success are you seeing with that over the last, I guess you're going to kind of see the results of that over the next 6 months. So it's hard to say really. And I'm interested because I know your background is sales development. And as you mentioned, Uhubs, helping teams onboard and develop those structures to make that much easier. I mean, how much of that is change management inside the company on that CS side? I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, it's a great question. It really depends on the size of the organization. So we have one segment of customers who are now moving much more to like a self-serve motion, who I'd describe as SMB. So, these are typically Series A companies with a head of sales, typically no sales ops or rev ops yet, a handful of reps. So perhaps, like 5 to 6 AEs, some SDRs. And what we're finding is that head of sales is so stretched. They need a lot more guidance. And also they are willing, the good ones are willing to put their hands up and say that they don't know. Like, they've never been in RevOps or enablement, so they don't know what good looks like. So there is a big role for us to play there in terms of thought leadership, content, coaching, on-demand demos, tutorials. And the big thing we've been focusing on is templates. If you're a head of sales and you're trying to figure out what does a good SDR onboarding process look like, instead of just like spending late nights killing yourself trying to do it from scratch, let's just make your life easier and let's just give you like a preloaded template that we've built with loads of other customers at your stage. So that's the focus for the earlier stage segments. And then I'd say, the companies as they grow and they scale, when we're working with like a RevOps team, for example, they've got a bit more experience. They've got know-how, they tend to have a better handle on what good looks like. So quite often they'll be using Uhubs with their own structure and flow already. And what they'll be doing is just embedding it and using our technology to make it scalable. So there's actually, it's kind of strange. It's almost like the slightly bigger customers at the moment need a little bit less guidance than the smaller ones do. But then it's nuanced, right? Because then the bigger customers, as they start to scale and their tech stack start to get much more mature, then they start requesting a lot more things around integrations and custom integrations. And then the CS burden starts to increase.
Thinking about RevOps, and this ties on quite nicely, actually. This is a question from our previous guest, Seamus Ruizel, and he's the CEO, founder of Carabiner Group. And he's asking you, Matt, how do you see sales training and enablement fitting into RevOps strategy for an organization, particularly in the way that they adopt and embrace tech?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I had the pleasure of meeting Seamus in London a few weeks back at the CRO Summit. We had both of us were offered booze. We had a non-alcoholic drink afterwards. Yeah, it's a great question. And hey, look, it's a really interesting time for enablement and training. I think the one reflection I got is 2021, 2022, we saw a big explosion in enablement and enablement roles. Lots of companies hiring for them, lots of investment went into enabling sales teams. And, when the times are good, it was almost like go, 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 let's just get as much as we can out of the teams. We saw a correction to like Q4 and Q1 of this year. Unfortunately, a lot of enablement people lost their roles. And I think what we are seeing is that in a lot of cases, a solo enablement person has struggled in a lot of cases to justify their strategic value to the leadership team. I think that hasn't been as much of a problem for revenue operations. And I think the reason for that is RevOps is much closer to, in most cases, I'm speaking in general terms here, RevOps leaders are much closer to the business strategy. And they typically, sit very closely alongside the CRO, or if there isn't a CRO, they're, delivering the forecast straight into the CEO. And what that means is RevOps can have much more strategic and business level conversations with exec teams. Therefore, they can justify their existence more. I find that the last 18 months, a lot of pure enablement and training roles have struggled to elevate themselves up to that level. And they've just remained as like operational headcount who are just reactive to sales leaders in the organization. Oh, this sales leader needs a training on negotiation, so I'm going to like bow down and just quickly spin that up for them. And in the end, you just end up being like a busy fool within the organization. And unfortunately, that's the fate that we've seen a lot. So I actually see like this future. I think I do see enablement sitting within RevOps actually. And I think that's where it should belong. I see RevOps owning the keys to the tech stack, the strategy, the direction, and how to operationalize the whole go-to-market function. I see an enablement leader sitting within that team, but I think the enablement leader of the future has to become much more data literate. They have to have a much greater understanding of the business objectives, and they have to be able to communicate how enablement and training initiatives that they're running are making an impact on the overall revenue number indirectly. And I think these days of just like throwing an enablement person on is like a nice to have who's just going to support your revenue team. That's not going to fly with CFOs and CEOs in this climate. Like everything that you are investing in has to be moving the needle. But yeah, I fundamentally see like RevOps owning it, but not delivering it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fantastic answer, Matt. Those are all of the questions that I've had for you today. For anyone listening or watching this episode, there'll be a bunch of resources and links to where you can find information about Matt, Uhubs, and anything else that we've spoken about in this episode. Matt, before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with? Any final parting words?
Hey, final parting words. I think the final parting word for me would be to all revenue leaders out there who are trying to figure out how to hit their revenue number in the second half of this year and through the next year. And they're trying to figure out how to do that with perhaps not as much headcount as they originally planned. My kind of word of advice or kind of thought for the day would be, what are you going to do differently to enable your team to become more productive, to catch up and hit that number? Because I'm just seeing a lot of revenue leaders, right now they've cut back and then they're banging their heads against the wall because their reps are just so far away from where they need to be that they're not doing anything differently. So think, have an open mind, think differently about how you can solve that problem. And that there are obviously, partners like myself who can help solve that challenge.
Amazing. Really appreciate it, Matt. And for those listening, we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Cheers, Freddie.